The first rumor curled through Los Angeles like a bruise beneath makeup. Taylor wanted out. Not out of love, love was the stubborn shadow that had followed her across decades, but out of a city that had never learned to cradle a soft heart without cutting it. The whisper seated itself in doorways and elevators, in the lacquered silence of boardrooms and the salty air of the beach road, until it became a low throb of inevitability. She was leaving because the heart that had survived bullets, betrayals, and the endless ricochet of regret could no longer bear the rhythm of Ridge. The body keeps score, so does memory. And Taylor's memory had become a metronome, ticking toward a limit she could finally name. 3 months, the cardiologist said in a voice that tried to be both clinical and kind. It might be 6. It might be 3 days. The heart could let go like a candle winking out, or it could hold on, stubborn, through one last season of sunsets. The unpredictability was its own cruelty. In the stillness after that appointment, when the hospital corridor hummed and the city outside glittered with an indifference that felt cosmic, Taylor understood that certainty would not save her, but clarity might. She could not control the hour, but she could decide the meaning of the hours left. She drove the coast road with the windows down, breathing the salted edge of the Pacific until her chest loosened and the raw ache inside her softened into something she could carry. The beach house, a weathered sanctuary with wild rosemary growing against its fence and gulls stitching the horizon, stood exactly as she remembered from other endings and other beginnings. It posed no questions. It made no demands. It simply opened its door, and its familiar sea light said, "Here is air that doesn't lie." She stepped onto the deck and let the idea of leaving Los Angeles turn into the act of arriving somewhere honest. Then, in a gesture that felt like pulling thread from a ruined seam, she dialed Ridge. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough. "Come," she said. Not to fight, not to negotiate an old argument into new shapes, but to listen. And bring Steffi. Because families do not fracture cleanly, and because legacy requires witnesses, and because the truth she had been carrying had weight meant to be shared. Ridge arrived like weather, storm pressed into a man who had always confused motion with direction. The first seconds on the deck were clumsy with all the histories they wore like wool in summer. He had that look, the one he got when he wanted to say the right thing but felt trapped by the fear that the right thing no longer existed. Steffi followed, contained and luminous, the ocean wind lifting a strand of hair at her temple as if to remind her that even the disciplined can be undone by small mercies. Taylor did not waste grace by making them stand. She invited them inside, poured tea that none of them drank, and let silence do the work of sanding down pride until confession could take hold. Then she said the words that would change the angle of every room in their lives. 3 months. The cardiomyopathy had advanced, the ejection fraction a fraction of what hope pretends it can be. A coronary event could arrive without warning, like lightning out of a clear sky, like a memory that makes the knees go weak. She would not die at Forrester Creations. She would not die in the car on Mulholland trapped between asphalt and indecision. She would die where the light was honest. She would go to the sea. Ridge did not hear the whole sentence at first. He heard the part where time puts its hands around a throat. His denial was not loud. His denial had learned subtlety with age, but it was stubborn, a craftsman building a chair that could not hold weight. "We'll get another opinion," he said. "We'll fly to Zurich. We'll talk to specialists in Kyoto who are rewriting the rules of the heart." Steffi's eyes went wet but steady, a woman who had learned early that tears could be truth's most eloquent punctuation. She asked the question that was not a question. "What do you want?" The way she said it, the focus on want rather than must, broke something open in Taylor. Maybe because Ridge had so often made love a referendum on what he needed, and Steffi, for all her ferocity and control, understood that care begins with listening to another person's noun. "I want to choose," Taylor answered. And Ridge, hearing the word choose, heard accusation. The narrative he had always told himself, of a man caught between two epic loves, forced into impossible toggles by fate, did not have space for the possibility that he was not a victim of love, but its architect. He swallowed, that little clench at the jawline, and he nodded because nodding is what a man does when faced with a truth he cannot redirect without becoming monstrous. But Taylor had not summoned them only to announce an ending. She had come to stage a softer revolution. She had learned that a heart does not merely fail from disease. It fails from carrying too many unspoken things. So she spoke. She made of her vulnerability a mirror and placed it gently in Ridge's hands. "There was a time," she said, "when I mistook your indecision for complexity. When I told myself that the oscillation between me and Brooke was the mark of a love so large it shattered ordinary grammar. But oscillation can be its own addiction, and sometimes the refusal to choose is a kind of cruelty disguised as sophistication. I say this not to indict you. I say it because absolution requires accuracy." She watched his face carefully, not to wound him, but to confirm that he remained capable of being reached. Then she turned to Steffi and did something rarer than confession. She asked for help. "This will look like abandonment to some," she said, "and like manipulation to others. But I need you to help me translate it correctly for the family. I am not leaving to punish anyone. I am leaving to love the time that remains so fiercely that regret cannot pry it from my hands. Help me make that the story. It would have been easier, so much easier, to let grief sharpen into anger and name a villain." But Taylor's retaliation had matured past rage into a kind of luminous clarity. Her soft counterattack was this: to force Ridge to stand in the precise geometry of his consequences without shouting, and to invite Steffi to become not merely a strategist or brand custodian, but a daughter who could hold nuance without turning it into leverage. When you tell the truth without theatrics, you leave the other person nowhere to hide. Ridge tried for a moment to take sanctuary in logistics. He spoke about advanced directives, about home health aides, about medical equipment delivered discreetly to the beach house so that dignity would not be a casualty of medicine. Taylor listened and thanked him, and then set the boundary that would preserve the soul of what she was doing. "I will accept care," she said, "but I will not live in a hospital disguised as a living room. If I wanted to die surrounded by machines, I would die in a hospital. I want to die surrounded by the sound of waves. And I want to spend whatever time there is teaching my heart to unclench from the past." The days telescoped after that, small and large at once, nimble and heavy, as if time had learned elasticity out of respect for what she was attempting. She organized the unglamorous papers that turn chaos into mercy for the living: will, insurance, letters to be opened only after. She wrote notes by hand because handwriting makes promises the printer cannot. One to Thomas, tender and candid, about creation as a form of moral courage. One to Hope, surprising even herself, about forgiveness as a design principle. One to Brooke, yes, Brooke, about the strange sisterhood of survivors who have loved the same difficult man and still managed to keep their own names. "You were my rival and my reflection," she wrote without flattery or poison. "I wish us both a good ending." Ridge read none of these in that moment. They were not for him yet. He busied himself with practicalities because practicalities were the one place he felt he could make love into action without risking the humiliation of contrition. But at night, when the house fell into that soft hour between owl and dawn, he stood on the deck and watched Taylor sleep in the daybed by the window, the breath shallow but still insistently regular, and he rehearsed apologies he had never learned how to perform without making them about his own torment. Steffi, meanwhile, became the steward of narrative. She understood better than anyone that stories are the oxygen of families and companies alike. She called a family meeting at a time of day when tempers are least hungry. She told them, calmly, precisely, what the doctors had said, what Taylor wanted, and what would be required of them if they wished to be worthy of their love for her. She told them there would be no martyrdom economies, no public scenes where grief turns into gloating. She told them that if anyone tried to use Taylor's exit as a stage for old wars, she would remove them from the set without applause. And because she spoke with authority earned rather than borrowed, most listened. Those who didn't, the few who refused to believe any truth not theatrically lit, found themselves strangely quiet under the gaze of a woman who had traded posture for presence. The beach house became a pilgrimage site, not for spectacle, but for a gentler confidence. Friends came in ones and twos with soups that smelled like childhood, with quilts sewn by hands that understood touch as sacraments. Pam baked as if butter could shore up a crumbling shoreline. Katie arrived with that particular intelligence she always kept partially sheathed, asking fewer questions and making better observations than anyone. Even Bill stood at the edge of the deck one dusk, contrite without confession, offering a small speech about the losses that recalibrate men who thought themselves immune to physics. Taylor accepted these offerings with a grace that looked like art because it had been practiced for decades. She learned the choreography of conserving breath: shorter sentences, longer gaze, fewer words, more presence. She stopped explaining her choice and started inhabiting it so fully that explanation became redundant. When pain rose like a tide, she rode it without hating the water. When fear woke her at 3 a.m., she named it like a child and told it a story in which it lost some of its fangs. Ridge kept returning, drawn by a magnetism he had always called love, but now suspected might also be accountability masquerading as devotion. He brought sketches as offerings, as if beauty could broker a truce with endings. He brought silence, too, which, in a life so often loud with declaration, felt like an evolution. On a morning rinsed clean by rain, he came with a question that started in his throat and landed in his eyes. If I had chosen differently sooner, would your heart have lasted longer? It was an indecently human question, the kind that flirts with self-centeredness, but is at its core a bid for absolution before death extinguishes the chance for repair. Taylor did not rescue him with an easy lie. She told him that bodies are ecosystems and stress is a climate, that no one act breaks a heart but weather does, that his patterns had been hurricanes, but hers had been the insistence on building glass houses on a cliff. I am responsible for the architecture of my hope, she said, without cruelty. You are responsible for the storms you sent. We are both responsible for the reconstruction we never learned to do together. If this is a reckoning, let it be gentle. He nodded, both wounded and relieved, because there is a liberation in being told the truth by someone who loves you enough not to turn it into a weapon. Steffi began to divide her days between the office and the beach house with an efficiency that did not strangle tenderness. She turned logistics into kindnesses: a better chair on the deck that aligned with the angle of the sun in the late afternoon, deliveries timed so that doorbells would not startle from sleep, a rotation of visits that preserved intimacy without letting devotion become surveillance. She also made a decision that surprised those who thought they knew the contours of her ferocity. She reached out to Brooke. Not as an emissary of Ridge, not as a strategist, but as a daughter who had seen her mother choose grace and wanted that choice amplified rather than diluted by old rivalries. Brooke came, hesitant the way women become when they have shared too much history to trust peacetime easily. They did not revisit the ledger. They sat side by side on the deck and watched the late light pour honey over the water. When Taylor woke, she smiled a smile that held no acid and said, "You look tired, Brooke. Sit. Take some of this light." Brooke's tears were a quiet thing. She took Taylor's hand, surprised by the eloquence of a truce that did not require speeches. The city, of course, performed its usual pantomime of rumor and spectacle. Headlines speculated. Commentators invented narratives where restraint would have been more elegant. But Los Angeles, for all its neon swagger, has a secret respect for anyone who orchestrates an exit with taste. Word spread, beneath the noise, of a woman deciding her last season with a precision that shamed those still pretending immortality is a plan. And within Forrester Creations, something altered. Designers found themselves sketching with more courage, as if the proximity of mortality freed them from the cowardice of trend. Seamstresses sewed like prayer, each stitch a syllable. Marketing, for once, learned to speak in sentences that did not insult the intelligence of grief. A quiet decision was made. No tribute show drenched in melodrama, no limited capsule collection of clichés. Instead, garments that understood restraint, lines that felt like promises kept, a palette that expanded the definition of softness beyond pink. Taylor watched from the deck, when she had strength, and from the daybed, when strength became a narrower corridor. She accepted visits from colleagues she had once only tolerated for the sake of family peace, and found, in the ridiculous grace of dying, that sympathy expands one's appetite for humanity. She read poetry slowly, so that language could saturate the dry places. She wrote a list that did not include achievements. It contained ordinary divinities: to taste figs warm from the market, to nap to the soundtrack of rain, to listen to Stuffy laugh with her whole mouth the way she did at 7, to hear Ridge say sorry without a clause, to feel the dog's chin on her knee, to wear the blue sweater that still smelled like a winter she had forgiven. When pain pressed hard, she let it. When joy licked at the edges of the day like flame, she fed it by naming it out loud. The naming seemed to stitch something back together that science had written off. There were, inevitably, regressions. Ridge arrived one evening wound tight by the old fear that if he did not do, he could not love. He had found an experimental protocol in Sweden. He had spoken to a donor. He had formatted hope into a spreadsheet. The desperation in him made him almost boyish, which was in its way more heartbreaking than the grand gestures that used to exhaust her. She took his hands. "This is how I need you to love me," she said, and she placed his palms flat on the deck rail, so he could feel the vibration of the ocean translated through cedar. "Love me by standing still with me inside a moment." He tried. It took him 3 attempts before he managed to keep breath from turning into talk. When he finally did, they watched the dark come in without negotiating with it. Later, he said the thing no one expects from men who have made their names out of a beautiful refusal to settle: "If I had known how to be quiet sooner, maybe we could have kept more." She answered not with a counterfactual, but with mercy. "We kept enough to make this beautiful." In those last weeks that might have been months or might have been days, time, that middle-aged magician, guarding its secrets, Stuffy brought the children to the beach house after school. They learned to speak softly, without being afraid. Hayes asked why the machines at the hospital make noise, but this house sings. "Because the ocean doesn't need applause to know it's powerful," Taylor said, and it was the best explanation of dignity she had ever given. Kelly made bracelets. One for Grandma that had 5 blue beads, one for Mommy that had 3 green ones, one for Ridge that had exactly the same number as for Taylor, because equality has a moral clarity adults complicate. Taylor wore hers until the elastic gave up, then tucked the beads into a small bowl on the mantel, where she once kept shells. She liked the way loss kept turning into altars when you arranged the remnants right. The soft counterattack continued to do its work. Ridge, deprived of his usual weapons, justification, nostalgia, a talent for drafting other people into his private wars, began to reflect without slipping into self-pity's theater. He audited the archive of his own gestures and found too many IOUs masquerading as love letters. He did not confess this inventory to Taylor in full. He offered small receipts in the form of changed behavior instead. He began to leave Brooke out of sentences meant for Taylor, not as erasure, but as hygiene. He corrected colleagues gently when they tried to turn Taylor's illness into free-floating content. He stopped treating his grief as the most compelling narrative in any room. This, more than flowers or flights to Zurich, became the romance Taylor had always deserved, a man making himself finally worthy in the only currency that counts, practice embedded in time. On a morning made of silver, sky the color of wisdom, sea furred with a breeze light as good news, Taylor felt the first crisp edge of departure not as terror, but as clarity. The cardiologist had described it once: a narrowing of corridors, a fatigue that nested in the muscle like a quiet animal. She laid her hand on her sternum and felt not panic but a steadying. She called for Steffi. She asked for Ridge. She asked for quiet. They gathered in the room where the window framed the horizon in a way that made even death look like a continuation rather than a cliff. She did not offer last words polished for posterity. She had been speaking last words all along, in the form of days lived with unperformative care. She said simple things in a voice textured by softness. Be kind to the children in ways they will remember when they are 40. Don't sell the beach house. Let it teach you. Don't write revenge into your clothes. Write forgiveness into the seams. Ridge took her hand with a reverence that did not look borrowed. Steffi pressed her cheek to her mother's shoulder as if trying to learn, by osmosis, a kind of courage that doesn't announce itself with noise. When the pain came, it did not roar. It arrived like a tide fulfilling its appointment. She breathed through it the way she had taught other people to breathe through panic, and for the first time understood that all the teachings had been rehearsals for this exact choreography. Ridge felt the shift before science could have measured it. He did not shout for help this time. He placed his palm over hers and told her, without qualifiers, that she had been the best teacher he had ever had. Steffi began to hum, unselfconsciously, a tune from a childhood afternoon on a different coast when everything had seemed solvable by presence. The room held. The house did not perform tragedy. It witnessed a completion. When breath left, it did not slam the door. It stepped into the larger air. The days after were clean with ache. Steffi did the work grief demands of the confident. Phone calls that braid dignity and logistics, messages that spare others the exhaustion of guessing, meetings that reframe loss without reducing it. Ridge, for once, allowed the women to lead. He sat on the deck and watched the horizon assume the shape of a promise that did not need his editing. He read the letters Taylor had left and discovered in them no indictments, only precise offerings. In the one addressed to him, she wrote, "Do not make my death an alibi for becoming who you should have been all along. Become him anyway." In the one for Brooke, she enclosed a Polaroid from years ago, two women at opposite ends of a party, caught in one frame, both beautiful, both tired, both unwilling to be diminished. On the back she wrote, "I leave to you the task of raising good men and better myths." The memorial was not a spectacle. It was a garment. The collection that followed took its cues from the beach, hems that moved like tide foam, seams that refused violence, palettes that understood the shading between surrender and strength. There were no speeches that turned a woman into a trope. There were notes, poems by Szymborska and Sarton sewn into linings where only the wearer would know. There was a bench installed on the deck of the beach house with an inscription Taylor had chosen herself while still alive. Sit. Listen. Let the ocean edit you. And there was, in the private hours after the public goodbyes, a family that had learned, at last, that love does not need triangles to be strong, nor drama to be visible, nor ownership to be real. Rumors kept doing what rumors do. They speculated on Ridge and Brooke, on Steffi's reign, on whether Taylor's exit was a story beat or a life's end. Those who needed noise found it. Those who needed instruction found it, too, in the most unlikely place, the quiet after a woman's final, fierce choice. If Taylor's heart had failed, it had also succeeded in teaching everyone who watched her go that endings can be designed not to punish, but to free. She had chosen the beach over the boardroom, clarity over choreography, confession over control. She had left Ridge with the mirror, Steffi with the map, Brooke with a blessing, and the rest of us with a question that tasted like salt and light. If you knew the hour was near, would you spend your life performing your pain, or would you go to the place where the air tells the truth and write your last season like a love letter to presence? In the months that followed, the beach house did not become a shrine so much as a school. Steffi brought the children often, to teach them that grief is not a haunted house but a grammar. Ridge came alone sometimes, to sit where he had learned to be still and to practice it until stillness no longer frightened him. Brooke returned once, left flowers, and took nothing but a deeper breath. The ocean kept doing its patient work on the rocks, wearing them into shapes the eye could call beauty without knowing why. And the city, bruised and glittering, kept moving, unaware that somewhere along its edge a woman had taught a few people how to end well, not by winning, not by losing, but by choosing a truth that fit the size of her remaining life.